Carson, talk to me a little bit about the implications of the cloud on security, very broadly. How many people here know what the cloud means? How many people don't? How many people aren't listening? Well, maybe you could quickly define what the cloud is and why you think the cloud changes everything when it comes to security.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So at DLD, we've heard a lot about big data. This week, we've heard a lot about analytics. Folks are getting DNA tested out in the lobby there. That all of these new technologies, these new analytics, these new capabilities take computing power. And in order for many organizations to do this kind of thing, they have to buy a lot of. Traditionally, they would have had to buy lots of hardware to do this kind of computing. We all probably heard from Werner Vogels from Amazon EC2 talking about EC2 and the kinds of things that they enable. EC2 is probably, from the perspective of hosting applications and analytics in the cloud, they are basically a provider that has a massive pool of storage and computing resources that they make available publicly to anyone who wants to use them. And so that's essentially what the cloud is. So when you see analytics happening, when you see startups that are being created within weeks, most of these types of new technologies are actually starting and growing in the cloud. And what that means is that those are resources that aren't in a typical data center. They're outside of the typical normal controls. What that means from a security perspective is twofold. One is that security gets done very differently in those kinds of environments. The issue from a privacy perspective and a data perspective is there's much more data out there that's ever been out there before because of big data and analytics and things like that. Assuming that privacy, assuming that all the things are in place that need to be, probably the biggest new implication of cloud is the amount of data that can be processed, the amount of data that can be stored. That's all available to people who would want to have at it for less savory reasons than perhaps some of the folks we've heard from today. So attackers know this, they know these huge amounts of data are out there, and they're looking to gain access to this data in mass, in bulk, as opposed to a little bit at a time. So that's probably, from what we've heard from DLD, the biggest implication.
So Carson, what should we most fear about security, data security on the cloud? Should we be worried as individual consumers? Should we be worried as citizens? Should we be worried about our personal safety? What are your biggest fears?
You should just be worried. I think that's it. No, I think that I think about worry and I think about what to do. Right, so that's sort of the way I kind of look at it. The most critical thing really about any online application, and to be honest, it doesn't matter if it's cloud or not, when you put your data in someone else's hands, it's really partially your responsibility to be critical about that. You wouldn't take your money and take it to a bank and put it in a bank that has windows open on the sides and they get a vault door made of wood. You look, you think, you make decisions about how you're being careful with those assets. And each person, each company that's responsible for any type of personal data, whether it's your own or someone else's, has a responsibility to be critical and look at, when I use this service, are they secure? Are they adhering to the standards? Have they been audited?
But isn't it true, I don't know for most of you, but when I use a cloud service, I'm just a consumer. I haven't got the foggiest idea about secure. They're obviously going to say, well, we're wonderfully secure. They're not going to say, well, and by the way, there's a 15% chance of all your data being stolen in the next 20 minutes. So how can people know whether or not stuff on the cloud is secure?
That's a good question, and it's one of the challenges.
They've got to use your stuff, right? Here's your plug. Tell everyone what your good product you've got.
Yeah, Cloud Passage does help quite extensively with sites that do host in the cloud. But from a consumer's perspective, one of the problems is there's no good housekeeping seal of approval for a software as a service provider yet. There's an organization called the Cloud Security Alliance. It's a US-based organization that works internationally. Cloud Passage works very closely with the CSA to try to establish standards that a consumer could get their arms around. So there is literally a seal of approval that says this site has been certified and it is reasonably safe and it meets reasonable standards.
And is that a good thing? Will a seal of approval provide a solid foundation for consumers?
I think it's better than what we have today, which is very little. So today, it's the best you can do. It's the best you can see. It's interesting. We ask people about security, and we go out and we talk to startups and different companies, and we hear this very often. What do you do for security? And they say, well, we have the little lock in the corner on the browser, and that's great. And they think that's all there is to it. There's obviously quite a bit more to it than just something simple like that. So the seal of approval, something that a consumer can look at, they can get more detail on. Consumers are learning to look for those things. I think especially now with more online attacks, more phishing attacks, things like that, people are becoming savvy. So I think it does help. I think it does give sort of a standard that they can look for, and they know how to do it now. So it's less an issue of being able to find it. It's more an issue of having the standards available. And that's really what we're working on today with CSA and other organizations to try to make a ruler to have something to measure by.
But as all data does migrate to the cloud, what are the implications for security? Should we be more or less optimistic? Does it make our data more or less secure?
It's another great question. So I think the short answer is it can be more secure. It can be much more secure. So we work with a lot of very large enterprises that are moving to the cloud, and they're used to owning their own data center. And there's actually a bit of a misnomer about the cloud that it's inherently less secure than a data center. It's really not the case. If you look, for example...
Why is that misnomer? Is it because of the abstraction of the cloud?
It is. It's because no one can see it. No one knows what it is. It's really an abstract idea. So it frightens people. If you can't see it, you can't measure it, you can't get your head around it, you're afraid of it. And the instinctive reaction is to think that it is less secure. Before there was cloud, interestingly, the vast majority of data compromises came from within the data center. Right? So data centers really aren't some enclave that's bulletproof and can't be compromised in any way. Cloud environments in many ways can be much better. So for example, if you look at Amazon EC2, it's a good example. They've got hundreds, thousands of customers that they have to deal with a certain number of security items for, and they're going to do an exceptional job of it because they're doing it for many, many people. If you layer on security on top of that with a product like ours, with Cloud Passage, to give you additional security, intrusion detection and things like that, that's something that we're going to do for many, many companies. We have the benefit of that scale, we have the benefit of that visibility and data, and that's something you can't do individually. So there is a strong belief in many circles, I'm in this camp, that you can actually have a more secure data experience in the cloud than you could in a data center or even on your home PC. So I think that the reality is definitely on the way that will be the case.
Who invented the term the cloud? I think it's a major marketing mistake.
I think it was Larry Ellison.
Larry Ellison. And do most people here think that the cloud is a user-friendly term? Does it make you nervous?
Who's nervous about the cloud? Someone's terrified about the cloud. Yeah.
Why? Do we have a mic in the audience? Maybe some people can tell us what is it about the cloud, either theoretically or in practice, makes you so nervous? And you have an expert here to calm you down.
Or not. Is there someone with a mic?
Or you can just shout your question.
Yeah, it's pretty quiet.
I don't know where my data are.
You don't know where your data is. The good news is that some of your providers may. And so this is one of the things. So one of the interesting things about the cloud, to that specific point, people ask us what's new about cloud security and what do we do that's different. One of the things about a service provider, an application service provider, putting data in a cloud environment, servers aren't bolted down any longer. They're not physical things anymore. They're actually just giant files, and they can go anywhere. So one of the things that Cloud Passage does to help with that very problem is we geolocate servers, which sounds like an insane thing. Why do you need to geolocate a server? Because it's not a physical entity anymore, it can be anywhere. So we geolocate them to make sure that your data stays in the right country, stays in the right data center, doesn't end up in North Korea. We've had cases with customers where servers have been copied wholesale, the entire virtual server, and it's ended up in Russia. And we see them light up, and our product sort of snatches them back. So I don't know where your data is either. But this is a lot of the regulations, and we heard about a lot of the privacy regulations about where data can be stored. The EU is particularly good about it, but I think this comes back to the issue of the seal of approval. What's missing today, and just as when the internet started out, we started to connect our homes to the internet, what was missing was a lot of the comfort level, the packaging of information to give to a consumer to let them know where is your data, is it safe, is it being handled the way it should be handled. So it's on the way, but until then, hold your breath and be judicious. Is there another question?
Other questions?
Is the fear that people will attack the cloud infrastructure? Because if I'm a company that provides its services through the web, it doesn't really matter if I'm a consumer accessing that service. To me, I want to make sure it's secure for me end to end, and that, I'm kind of indifferent to the cloud. What's added with the cloud is the fact that maybe somebody can compromise the cloud itself. And Amazon for sure is putting a lot of effort into making sure that they're a lot more secure than any individual provider is.
That's right. It's very true. And I go back to the point of the data centers. Data compromise has been happening in data centers forever, and they still do. They're in the paper constantly. From being worried about data end to end. There was a conversation earlier. I think Warner was talking about security and really. I think this was a mix of a conversation I had with him last night and a conversation that he had on stage today. Encryption is going to be really key. And the ability for you, the consumer, to be able to encrypt your data before it even goes to the cloud. I think that, when you look at how data gets compromised, there are two big buckets that you can put those data compromises into. Three, let's go with three. So one of the buckets is they're able to get something on your phone. They're able to get something on your endpoint. You open a video, you open a file, whatever it is that you do. Many compromises have happened this way. And then they actually take control of your device. They can capture passwords. Okay, this is kind of a huge problem. Companies like Kaspersky focus on that, right? So they deal with that endpoint security. Second way that this can happen is through social attacks, phishing attacks, trying to figure out your passwords. Trying to learn information about you from social sites and guess that your password might be the combination of your cat's name and your daughter's name or something like that. The third way is what we focus on. We focus on the actual vault, right? The actual infrastructure itself. And when you see the truly massive data compromises where you hear of 35, 40, 50 million passwords or account records or healthcare records being exposed, that's typically an infrastructure attack, right? So they're backing a truck up to the bank, they're ripping the back wall out, and they're loading up the dump truck with money and driving away. That's what we focus on. So the answer is all three matter. All three of those matter. And even with cloud, there are a lot of companies today, a sister company, if you will, of ours is called Cloudflare. They focus on that application part, right, to make sure that the application piece is secure. But all of the components really have to be addressed or data compromises will continue to grow.
I'm still confused here. Can you tell us the real difference between the cloud and the data center? Isn't the Amazon cloud is not the Amazon data center?
It's interesting. So cloud is really less of, it has to do less with a physical environment, and it has to do with how it's accessed. Right? This is part of the problem with describing cloud. So if you want to gain, so let me sort of bullet list the characteristics that we consider cloud. No matter where it's physically located, clouds tend to be self-service. You can create your own servers, you can gain access to your own storage. Clouds tend to be not owned by you. Right? Someone else, you're using someone else's resources partially or in full. That's one of the big use cases. eBay, I think actually coined the term lease the spikes. So they actually use, external resources to do a large amount of their computing. The networking environment, if you're very technical, is very flat. It's very different. It's not segmented up the way it used to be. So it's a much more open environment. It's much more a very large pool of resources that are up for grabs. Whether that be in a data center, Cloud Passage works with a number of large banks that are doing this to their internal data centers because it's so much more efficient. They've looked at Amazon, they've looked at Google, they want that efficiency. So it's really, creating a large shared pool of resources, whether that be internal, whether it be external, high levels of automation, self-service. That's really what cloud means. And as a result, many of the applications that you use today are run in those environments, whether it's a bank, whether it's a startup, whatever the case may be. So that's really how you can define cloud sort of broadly, and then the software that goes on top of it, software as a service, typically runs in one of those types of environments. Does that help? Hope that helps. Okay.
Carson, let me ask you another question. So a lot of the theme of this conference has been big data and the significance of big data. As we are increasingly, as individuals and as a culture, defined by our data, and as everything does migrate to the cloud, and the nature of the scale of these economies lend itself to a very small group of companies actually owning the cloud, from Amazon to Google, I don't know, to Apple, to maybe Oracle, to one or two others. Should we be fearful about this? I mean, are we going to be, as individuals, owned? If we are increasingly defined by our data, and our data is owned by one of these huge big data cloud companies, is that something that we should be worried about? Apart from security, but in a broader sense as well. So
Amazon, for example, the actual infrastructure provider will never, quote unquote, own your data. It's really the application owner. So the question then is, does Mint.com own your data, right? There's a lot of legal trouble around this right now. There's a lot of legal catching up that has to be done. This was discussed in the earlier panel quite extensively. Data ownership is a great big question. So if I take your data and I derive other data from it, whose data is that? Is it mine? Is it yours? Most organizations, you actually do retain control of your own data. You're able to delete your data. It's when your data becomes, abstracted and rolled into, statistics and things like that. But in terms of your personal identity being in the cloud, again, it comes back to being judicious about that. I personally detest photographs, to be honest. There are a lot being taken. That's okay. I'm very careful about putting data out there, because once it's out, it's out. And that's one thing to keep in mind. In many cases, it doesn't matter whether Google has it, whether anyone has it, if they're using it. We really think of Carson, it in terms of compromise.
Finally, the EU, and last year Viviane Reding from the EU spoke here. She's sponsoring a bill about forgetting data. The consumer has a right to have that data forgotten. Very, very briefly, you've got a minute and a half. Firstly, what do you think of that? And secondly, is it practical?
I think it makes perfect sense, and I think that it's practical over time. So this is one of the situations. A good example is when the United States passed laws requiring stronger authentication for online banking. Right? There was a massive problem. People were having their online banking credentials stolen very, very easily. Billions of dollars were being lost. And regulation was put in place in the mid-2000s. The FFIEC required stronger authentication. This is when your grandmother's maiden name, these kinds of things started to appear. It's something I worked extensively on with the banks. So in the situation where there's a new law that says that any consumer can go to any software provider and say, I want my data to be gone, my data to be deleted completely, new solutions, new mechanisms, new companies will appear that do that. And that, I think it's actually a very good thing, and I think that it will, if it does become a law, will stick.
Well, Carson Sweet, you say data, I say data, but you're Mr. Data, Mr. Security. Thank you so much. Extremely educational.
Thank you.